My name is Alan Hertzke, and I'm going to be chairing this panel. I know we've had a very momentous morning, and we're still in the afterglow of our meeting with the Holy Father and a scintillating lunch, but we're ready to move on to our afternoon session. And to begin the presentations, Stefano, our chair, is going to make his presentation, so we can start the time now. Let me say one word before we do start. As a chair, I'm going to, once we start to the discussion, I'm really going to urge you all to keep the long discourses to a minimum and instead focus on questions to our speakers. Right.
Thank you. Today, we are having a very exciting day, so it's proper to take this opportunity to rest. Thank you very much, and let me start by delimiting somewhat the field of my presentation, mainly for reasons of time. First, I will skip all references and quotations from the magisterial document that specifically refer to the family. Gaudium et Spes, Familiaris Consortio, Gratissima Sane, until Amoris Laetitia. In the paper which is available, these quotations are represented. Second, I will not touch upon those topics which have been extensively dealt with in these 2 days and a half, in particular topics such as concerning the nature of the family and its genome. I take them for granted because it's not On the other hand, what I will focus in my presentation is on 3 specific questions. My approach is policy-oriented, so to speak. In other words, the reason for that is that there is a disproportion, that is my feeling today, between diagnostics and therapeutic. I use a medical metaphor. In other words, in comparative terms, we know much more about the situation of the family, what it is, etc., and much less on what to do in terms of our future activities in the various countries. So my approach is mainly devoted to the therapeutical side of the story. My first question deals with what the family brings in to society. Now, thanks to its constitutive elements, the family, as was already said, is the most relevant originator of positive social externality. As you know, externality is an economic concept which is sometimes used also elsewhere. In other words, effects which are not taken into consideration because of the rules governing the working of a market economy. In fact, the family not only is a powerful social shock absorber, but the family is the institution that first and foremost supports and safeguards the weakest. As such, the family acts as a provider of insurance against the various risks that persons face through their life in an uncertain world. Another important positive externality concerns the creation of human capital, which does not depend only, I say only, on investment in education and training. That is a point which deserves, in my opinion, great attention. Character skills are not less relevant today than cognitive skills. Instruction, it's okay for cognitive skills, but education is mainly meant to provide character skills. And character skills means, going back to Aristotelian tradition, the virtue ethics, the ethics of virtue. We have to practice with. So the first years of life, as we know, are a special period for children. We know the effects of early influence of love on brain development, self-esteem, and emotional security. That is why the family is so important. The family is particularly important for the formation of character skills, which does not mean that cognitive skills are less relevant. The point is that we keep on insisting in our societies on cognitive skills, but not the business world. If you are aware of how business managers, CEO behave, they said when we have to hire, nowadays we look first on character skills and then on cognitive skills. That I received this information talking directly with them. Now, to conclude on this point, the metaphor that comes to mind is that of the beaver. As we know, in the world of animals, there are species which come to life simply adjusting themselves to the environment. In other words, species which are self-interested. But there are other species that while they try to adjust to the environment in order to protect themselves and the offspring, they operate in such a way to facilitate life to other species. This is the case of beavers. What is the job of a beaver? The job of a beaver is to gnaw the trunks of trees, transporting them nearby small rivers. In this way, they create ponds or small lakes where new type of animals, such as small fish or frogs, can live and reproduce. In my opinion, the family is like a beaver. That is important because that is the best way to recognize the positive role that in terms of generational positive social externalities has to be attributed to the family. However, in spite of the huge evidence, the family social capital is still ignored in the public debate and policy making. And the new household economics, a very influential research program in economics, initiated by Gary Becker, Nobel Prize winner in economics, in 1965, bears, in my opinion, a great responsibility in the under consideration of the family as a generator of bridging social capital. Now, Robert Patton has to go elsewhere, but as we know, he was the inventor of the distinction between bridging social capital and bonding social capital. By the way, he became famous exactly for that important distinction. Now, when we talk about family social capital, we refer to the bridging nature. And family has no other substitute. It's the most proper institution to create that. And as I said, it is unfortunate that the Gary Becker program, which is still dominant in economics, and as I keep on saying to my colleagues, don't undervalue the role of economics. Because, as you know, the thesis in epistemology of the double hermeneutic, there is a difference between economics and all other social sciences, in which sense that if an economic theory is spread and believed as true, it is certain that policymakers will follow suit. In other areas, you can produce a theory or another, but that will not have a direct impact on policymaking. So that is why it is important to consider that we are still under the dominance of the so-called new household economics paradigm, which recently has been a bit modified, but I can assure you is still the dominant one. And it is indeed in the absence of market and government failures, the idea is the family is visualized as a way to cope with market and government failures. And that is a way not to evaluate properly the family as an institution, as in particular relational good. My second question, I said three. My second question is, which premises are essential in the design of family policy. In other words, if we really want to apply family policy that recognize and revitalize the mediating role of the family, what are the fundamental premises? It is a fact that the growth during the last half a century of mega institutions, both corporate and governmental, has undermined the family as a society's mediating institution, a point that was made earlier this morning and yesterday. Now, a first premise to new policy making is the affirmation of the family as a subject possessing its own identity and autonomy, which is not yet the case. Acceptance of this premise will push us to rethink the usual mode of perceiving the working of a market economy. Because, as you know, this would imply a major change in our system of national accounting that continue to misrepresent the role and the potential of the family in the design, for instance, of welfare policy. As you know, it is still the practice that in the market operate two sets of agents, consumers and producers. Producers are the firm, whatever they are. Consumers are household. And so in the national accounting, the family is considered as a locus of consumption. And I cannot understand why even intelligent people do not understand that. Unless we change this, there is nothing to do. We can cry, we can protest, but nothing will happen. Because when the institution, the statistical national institution produce the national accounting, look and check. The family is considered as a consumer entity. So if the family is a consumer, those living in the family, that is typical for the women, they are consumers because the family produces nothing. The only producers are the firms. And that is a mistake, logical mistake, which was done already in the 30s when the national accounting system was established. I remember that I had the fortune to have as a supervisor in Oxford, John Hicks, Nobel Prize, in my opinion, the top economist of European economy of last century. He was the inventor of the national account. Kuznets was, in a sense, a pupil of John Hicks. And I remember that John Hicks, before dying, he said, we did a terrible mistake because we considered the family only as a locus of consumption. And then it's useless then to protest when we observe that certain laws take a particular characteristic. We have to modify that. That is the reason why, I have a quote from Antonio Rosmini. Antonio Rosmini, he lived 2 centuries ago, was one of the leading Italian philosophers. 2 centuries ago, he wrote, I quote, "The state must recompense the family for the indirect benefit gained by the whole of society from the family's domestic virtue. Compensate means that the state should give, not that the family should be considered as an institution solving the so-called governmental or market failures I was talking about." And that an approach of this type would have major consequences on the fiscal front in the direction of putting into practice the principle of horizontal equity in favor of family with children. And to this regard, let me mention that oikos is a Greek word, but oikos does not mean household, it means home. And why do we keep on talking about households? Household is a building. A home is a household inhabited by people. You can have a household with no people inside. And you understand that would make a major difference. So we have to reintroduce in the debate, cultural debate, the notion of the home, because the family inhabits a home not a household. Of course, the household is necessary, but that comes second. Now, let me move to my third question. The third question has to do with the vexata question of a new way to enforce policies aimed at establishing work-family harmony, what is termed nowadays work-life balance or conciliation between work, life, and family. Now, this is really an unfortunate expression that keeps on generating perverse results at the policy grounds. By the way, conciliation is the wrong word. Because what does it mean, conciliation? You conciliate between two elements which are in opposition. We have to talk about harmonization, harmony, not conciliation. Because the very moment you use the word conciliation, you are contradicting yourself, unless you want to maintain a certain conception of the family. I remember that when Benedict XVI was writing Caritas in Veritatis, and Benedict, as you know, is a philosopher, and he made the point very clear, because harmonization is a word which comes from Greek, and you know what does it mean, harmony in Greek. That is the idea to convey. In an orchestra, you have a violin and a piano. You are not supposed, if you are the director, to conciliate them, but to put them in harmony. And that makes a lot of difference. Because the very moment you use the word conciliation, you are self-destroying what you are supposed to achieve. Now, in a recent study by OECD, you know, the organization of the so-called advanced countries located in Paris, one reads, I quote, reconciliation policies include all those measures that extend both family resources and parental attachment to labor markets. You got it? That is a scandal. It's a scandal. Because that means that the family should adapt itself to the necessity of the labor market. Why not vice versa? And that is an official document, which was approved with no reaction. It did not stimulate any contradictory approach, etc. In other words, it is the family, according to the so-called gender mainstreaming, that has to adapt itself to the necessity of the economic process. We were talking even yesterday. I quoted in that occasion the Gaudium et Spes, number 67, which exactly says the same point. But nobody seems to take care of this official document. And in other words, it is time to take a firm stance against the ideology of efficiency at any cost, and its immediate consequence, which is the DINKS strategy. DINKS is an acronym which means double income, no kids. Double income, no kids, which means husband and wife, they have to work and get income, but no kids, because kids are an impediment. It is obvious from the ideology of efficiency, etc. So that is why it seems to me that bending the arch of technology to family needs, rather than expecting family to adjust to technology's demands, should be a priority for our society. And this is technically and economically possible. That is important. In other words, don't believe people who say, oh, that is impossible. It's not true, simply because people do not want to abandon the Tayloristic model of organization. Taylorism was born in 1911 in the States. And Taylorism had a major impact on the front of profit maker. But you should know that Taylorism is against the family. And Taylor wrote that in chapter 2 of his book. And people take Taylorism as something of nature, as if it were a datum of nature. Is it possible to continue this way? Today, we have an alternative model of labor organization, which is called Holocracy. And by the way, it was introduced in the United States because Americans are very pragmatic. I like Americans because they are pragmatic. When they realize that something goes wrong, they change. They do not pay attention to ideological, etc. And in fact, it was Brian Robertson, who in the year 2007 is from Harvard Business School. He published a book, the title which is Holocracy. Holocracy is just the opposite to Taylorism. And if you read that book, which has been translated in many different languages by now, and which was followed by many other contributions along the line, the basic idea is that the organizational work inside the firm should take the starting point of the family. In other words, if I am a manager of a CEO of a big or not necessarily big company, I have to start from the consideration of the family structure of those people living in my companies. That is something which is possible and that it's already underway. But unless we talk about these things, people talk about holocracy. People, they say, what is that? And still the book was published in the year 2007 in major university. That is something that I found it very, very strange to accept. And in fact, in paragraph 54 of Famiglia Amoris Laetitia, one reads, there are those who believe that many of today's problems have arisen because of feminine emancipation. This argument, however, is not valid, and Pope Francis demonstrates once more that he's a wise person from this point of view, etc. So that is why the new frontier of freedom today implies that the notion of freedom of choice must be progressively extended to the choice of life plans, not simply to the choice of bundle of commodities. It is our fault of economics as an official that when we talk about choice set, we always imply choosing among different bundles of commodities. But who said so? That is dogmatism, because it's not true. Why not consider the choice of life plans? Why we cannot organize the productive process in such a way as, in a particular time span, which is the 30s, because children are born during the 30s on average, okay? We have to take that into consideration if you want really to. In this regard, a new notion which is emerging today is the notion of corporate family responsibility. We know the notion of corporate social responsibility, and that is important, was a major advance. But we have to introduce inside that discourse the notion of corporate family responsibility, because the corporation is really responsible, according to the dominant notion of responsibility, if it, or as I said before, organizes itself in the direction which I have to move in a few minutes before leaving, etc. So it is obvious that where does this concept of the family's genome lead in practical terms? To a vision of a family as a common action. Now, there are three elements that characterize a common action. The first is that it cannot be completed without all those involved being aware of exactly what they are doing. The mere gathering of several people does not meet this requirement. The second element is that each of those involved in the joint action remains accountable for what he or she does, which is what distinguishes common action from collective action. Collective action is different from common action exactly for this reason. The third element is the unification of the efforts of those involved in the common action in order to achieve the same objective. So the family, it's a common action, but that is not enough. Why? Because there are different, diverse forms of common action. and hence diverse types of family. And that depends on the object of the communality. If communality may concern means only, or may also concern the end, telos, the telos of the action itself. In the first case, you have what is a business. After all, a business is a common action where people gather in order to put together the means. The family is the other one. That is why the family constitutes a common human good. But that is, I have to stop. This important question today is, how can we successfully resolve the problem of cooperation and thus share the experience of a common human good residing within the family community? This is, in my opinion, an area of research which, and as far as I know, has not been considered so far. In other words, it's not enough to state that it's a common action, the family. We need also to find under what is the strategy to be followed in order that the common telos, the common goal, is actually in practical achieved. To conclude, of course, these are not simple questions, but I have reasons to believe that we will enter sooner, perhaps better sooner than later, into a new phase, because people value family. And our societies, as has been said in these days from different angles of vision, they need a family. And a family which, just because it's a relational good, has to be structured along the lines of a common good, which defines its originality. If that can be achieved, I think so. I am rather optimistic because that is what, as I said this morning talking to the Pope, the family has been not abolished, but deconstructed. But if it has been deconstructed in the same way, if that is our will, we can reconstruct it. Thank you very much.